Human beings have been committing crimes for thousands of years, and in this world, the mobs and mafias and gangs that are organized existed far into the past. These people even existed in ancient Egypt and were documented in papyrus. Although Egypt is advertised as a very prosperous area where people can make as much money as they want, and it's showered with gold, as if the gods themselves handed it to them, leading them to create one of the most fascinating civilizations known to man. This did not come with negative consequences, because, of course, while the kings and the noblemen were able to eat, there were still some people who were at the bottom of society. These people who lived in the cold, dark corners of Egypt formed gangs and groups that would attack people, open graves, and in the most organized way, tear open the pyramids. And so Egypt organized a group of men, Nubians, perhaps for their reputation of violence. But these men did not just operate as cops, they operated as detectives, walking around Egypt asking questions and figuring out exactly where things were taken to. They were called the Magi. The Magi, who usually are seen walking around with dogs, the past is the same as the future, would be paid handsomely in order to find these people. The dogs, of course, came in handy as they do today, because we all know how dogs operated. Their ability to find things in hunting was obvious to these Magi, and when you're hunting for a criminal, it became just as useful, tracking down their scent and making sure that they served in the courts. Now, we might think that the ancient Egyptians were people who believed purely in magic, and the way that they did courts was just rock back and forth, as one of their methods were to discover whether or not you were innocent in the case of no evidence. But in real life, they gathered evidence, talked to witnesses, the same that is done today. Now, it's not hard to imagine that some people who were innocent were blamed for crimes, but some people were caught red handed. And one of these people had to answer for his crimes since they were so serious. This is documented in a papyrus. This document is called the Abbot Papyrus, and let us see one example of what happens when you commit crimes in ancient Egypt. The tombs blindfolded as a close prisoner, and he was given his sight when he reached them. The notables said to him, "Go before us to the tomb from which you say you brought the things." And the coppersmith went before the notables to a tomb of certain of 13, the royal children of the king Usamara, Seterpenser, the great god, in which no burial had ever been made, and which had been left open, and also to the house of the workman Amensen, son of Hui, of the necropolis, which is the spot, saying, "Behold, the places in which I was." The notables caused this coppersmith to be examined in the most severe examination in the Great Valley, but it could not be found that he knew of any place there save the two places he had pointed out. He took an oath on pain of being beaten, of having his nose and ears cut off, and of being impaled, saying, "I know of no place here among these tombs except this tomb which is open, and this house which I pointed out to you." The notables examined the seals of the great tombs which are in the place of beauty, in which rest the royal children, and the royal wives, and royal mothers, the noble ancestors and ancestresses of the Pharaoh. They were found intact. The great notables caused the inspectors, the sergeants, and the workmen of the necropolis and the chiefs of Mauzoi and Mauzoi and all the laborers of the necropolis to go round the west of No in a great demonstration as far as No. You can see from this that the Medjay were doing their job, and they had this person revealing all kinds of secrets. And of course, he gave up some of the accomplices that he worked with. By the way, in this papyrus, the Abbott papyrus, this is only one of hundreds of examples of people given with their names who are listed and shamed, in some cases, completely taken out of life for the crime of thievery. Most of the thieves who found great treasure in areas like gold and stuff like that would be completely gotten rid of or forced to do it themselves. What's worse is that a lot of the people who would be thieves inside of ancient Egypt would be people who have official jobs. Now, this should remind us of the modern day that just because you're employed doesn't mean you can afford to survive. And of course, when someone puts a lot of gold in front of you, that is going to start tickling you. And so here is a list of names of criminals who were caught and brought to justice, at least Egyptian style justice. The trumpeter Pepethel, Shed Sukons, Nasuman, Anke Fenkons, Amenkaun, son of the singer of the offering table. The list of men which the herdsman Balkuf gave, saying that they were in his gang of thieves. So what we have here is an informant from ancient Egypt, and this informant is telling the officials who exactly was in his gang of thieves. This doesn't necessarily mean they committed the crime, but they thieve with him. The list of men which the herdsman Bakoff gave, saying that they were in his gang of thieves. The workman Peretikaf, son of Hormin, the scribe of the divine records Nesuman, the incense roaster Shedsokons, the incense roaster Nesuman, called Thebe. Interestingly, he had to give himself up in order to get a lesser sentence because he was caught red handed. And the vizier who was in charge of catching him, a certain Medjay 100%, documents the proceedings. The herdsman Bakov of the Temple of Amun was brought. The vizier said to him, when you were about to that business in which you engaged, and the god caught you and brought and placed you in the hand of Pharaoh, tell me all the men who were with you in the great tombs. He said, as for me, I am a field worker of the temple of Amun. The citizeness came to the place where I was, and she said to me, some men have found something that can be sold for bread. Let us go that you may eat it with them. So said she to me. So the first person that he gives up is a woman. I found the trumpeter Perpetho and the foreigner Userhet Necht belonging to the prince of No, and the incense roaster Shed Sukons, and the incense roaster Nesuman of the temple of Amun, and the incense roaster Ankef Ekons of the temple of Amun, and Amenkau, son of the singer of the offering table Hori. Total 6. Now they levied themselves Deben of silver for each man and gave them to me. total deben of silver. He was examined with the stick, which basically means they beat him, which is quite the motivator. He said, "Stop, I will tell." The vizier said to him, "Tell the story of your going to attack the great and noble tombs." He said, "It was Peswer, a workman of the necropolis, who showed us the tomb of the queen Hebrazet. They said to him, 'The tomb to which you went, in what state did you find it?' He said, 'I found it already open.' He was examined with the stick again. Oh my God. He said, 'Stop, I will tell you.' The vizier said to him, 'Tell what you did.' He said, 'I brought away the inner coffin of silver and a shroud of gold and silver together with the men who were with me, and we broke them up and divided them among ourselves.' The scribe of the necropolis, Nesamanap or Nesamanape, said to him, 'If I went and stole a goat skin from a cattle shed and someone else went after me, would not I inform against him in order to make the punishment fall on him as well as on me?' He said, 'Whether the punishment, me alone or in a gang, in 10, with him in another gang.'" And then it cuts off. Now, obviously, this part is him regretting giving up the names of the people that he worked with, because obviously you're supposed to be together as thieves and not giving away intimate details about what you did. Now, to be fair, he got beaten half to death, so he probably had to do what he had to do. In terms of reality, it's obvious that the ancient Egyptians are no different than the people of today, in which crime is solved in the same way. You've heard of these people who say, like, police officers started in the 1300s or something like that. That is absolutely not true. Police officers with dogs who did detective work and had stations where they arrested people, where they kept people, where some people could argue for their cases on the other side. All of that existed in ancient Egypt, which is pretty much one of the oldest, if not the oldest, civilization on Earth. It just so happens to be, though, that the police in this case happened to be Sudanese men who ended up in Egypt via the Libyan road and the sea. A lot of these people today would be part of the Beja. For what reason these people were employed as police first and foremost over everybody else is actually an unknown thing. So, for those of you that don't know, this word meje, which you can see in hieroglyphics over here with a bird, a seeming like drop, and then a hand holding some kind of piece of pottery, spells out the word meje. And you can see that the word is put there with the word police. But we also know that the word meje is a Nubian tribe. And so this is how we know 100% that this Nubian tribe or Kushite tribe, whatever word you'd like to use, is 100% related to the police. In fact, they became synonymous with the police. Now, the question is, are there ranks? I mean, obviously, we read there was a sergeant, there was all of that. Are there ranks in this police system? 100%. So these are the ranks of the people who were put to enforce the law, and some, in some cases, to defend the law. The word vizier you will see come up in some of these hieroglyphics. So the first one is a magistrate or the police chief who deals with the local crimes. Now, a lot of the time in the writings, even though they're dealing with local crimes, you will always hear that there will be the opinion of the pharaoh, but this is not really the opinion of the pharaoh. what they're doing is they're talking on the behalf of the pharaoh. Just like if you say, you know, through the president, blah blah blah, this is the law. So that is what happened back in the day as well. So when they say they brought him to the pharaoh, it doesn't necessarily mean every single criminal who stole something was brought directly to the pharaoh so that the pharaoh could administer justice. I've seen a lot of people use that as a reason for why the pharaoh was a dictator. Like, he looked at every single crime himself and he passed the punishment. It's like, that's not how it worked. This was even in the movie The Prince of Egypt, where some thieves got caught and then they were put in front of the pharaoh, and then they had to decide what to do with them, and the pharaoh was like, oh, I'll just pardon them. And it was like, yeah, that's not how it worked. In real life, the pharaoh could not decide who was innocent and who was guilty. That is made up. That comes from the Bible, by the way, because Ramses in the Bible is seen as a dictator. But in real life, pharaohs couldn't even decide that their own family were innocent, which is why in the case of one of the pharaohs, I'm going to mention his name later, he the son of the pharaoh tried to kill him, the son's name being Pentawar, which Pentawar is the one who we have his DNA, and he was in the same area as his dad, although he was not as in well shape, probably as an example of this harem conspiracy where the wives of the king tried to remove him and put Pentawar as king, and then they held a court case. This court case was different than all the ones that I'm mentioning here. Demonstrated in one documentary, it was a speedy trial, which doesn't always happen in ancient Egypt. Sometimes you have to just sit with a bunch of criminals, and it was done in public, which usually court cases are usually done in public, but this one was done in private, not public, because they wanted to reserve the family. This is of Ramses the Third. Ramses the Third found himself at the other end of a knife made by his own wives. The next one is Imir Snorwai, and this word means the chief of police patrol or the patrolling police, as the first word suggests. These are not necessarily cops in they're more like cops in the sense that they walk around the street trying to protect it, and so people would not really commit crimes in their presence. So they're more of a defense squad. Now think how much crime there must have been in ancient Egypt for them to need this type of. I mean, in our head, we don't imagine that when we think of ancient Egypt. We think, oh, it's just a bunch of people working. There's administrators. There's this and that. Nope. You have police walking around. You have stations. You have people being brought to case. You have to cases. You have all of this going on at the same time. I wasn't going to add this one, but I think it's important that I do. These are the Medjay, but these Medjay are not the same as normal police. These Medjay guard the desert, meaning they guard the desert. They're more guarding the desert against Libyans and other enemies that come from outside of Egypt than they are guarding the people inside of Egypt. So they're more like border officers rather than the people who are guarding inside of the country. But these border officers, when basically there was too many of them, a lot of them started operating as internal, working inside, which is why the word police got mixed up with the word medjay, because they just started working as officers, normal ones. A lot of these, like I said, were Nubians, which is why that image that you saw, that animated image, is of a Nubian man. In my opinion, it's a bit too light though. They couldn't resist making it light skin. After that, after the desert police, you have the country police, and that one speaks for itself, so I don't need to go into that with too much detail. And then after that, we have the chief of the Medjay. Again, this is different than the normal chiefs. And finally, you would have something that is very important. So let's guess together. So if you have a court, you have cops, you have the criminals, what's missing? The answer is the judges and the lawyers. In ancient Egypt, as I mentioned, there were lawyers. The vizier acted as the lawyer. Unfortunately, unlike today, you were presumed guilty until proven innocent. Although viziers are high ranking political figures, these viziers were not necessarily the same. They were high ranking political figures for sure, but they definitely were not viziers in the same way that a vizier would be in the Islamic world. Uh, some viziers in the Islamic world doubled down as politicians and as lawyers as well. But for the most part in Egypt, these two were completely separate. The vizier of Nubia, for example, would be way different than this type. Now, you don't need to be a genius to know that most of the people who committed crimes were probably fairly hungry. I mean, even if we go and see the other one that I read, the reason why the person committed the crime, they said they found something that could be traded in for bread. This person was not stealing so that they could be rich. They were not they were stealing so that they could have bread. This is a very typical thing in the past. This is why it is very important, by the way, that when you still have the opportunity, you should try to make an honest living. You know, there's what's that old saying in Rome? It's like, how did you become poor? Was it fast or was it slow? And some people, it's slow because they don't pay attention to their lives. Instead, they live for the good times in the moment. And then when it's all gone, it's woe is me. But the only woe the ancient Egyptians will care about is saying woe after the baboons have torn you into little strips. Not only did this remind us that Nubians played a great role in ancient Egypt, but that they would be some of the most well educated and well treated people in ancient history. The Medjay and Nubians, and by default, other Sudanese people, were always part of the history of ancient Egypt, and they even had official roles to play. Thank you for watching.